So in our first video, we're going to cover some very, very basic information about the Old Testament, just to get us started. So what is the Old Testament? Well, we might say that the Old Testament is the literary self-portrayal of the Israelite people. In other words, how did the Israelites understand themselves? And who were the Israelites? They were a culture that lived on the east coast of the Mediterranean in ancient times, probably beginning around 1200, 1500, let's say, BC, before the Common Era, on the east coast of the Mediterranean. And you can see on this particular map, the red lines represent trade routes. So, in a very active part of the world, connecting Egypt and the Nile River to some of the other major civilizations, those in Greece and Asia Minor, as well as along the Tigris and Euphrates River. But basically, Israel was a very small area. If you go to modern day Israel, you will find out that things are very close together. It's not a big place. And in relationship to the other major civilizations and cultures of its time, a relatively obscure and minor player on the world stage. The Old Testament is also specific literature preserved and copied by the Israelites. So we have to think about not only the literature itself, but also the fact that it was remembered, probably first remembered and retold primarily in an oral culture, and then eventually written down, and then copied and recopied to preserve what we have today. The material in the Old Testament was also subject to a process of combination and editing. So it's not as though somebody just sat down and sort of began at the beginning, started writing material down, and then that's what was copied. So things were combined, things were rearranged, things were put into a particular order. So all of that work is part of what we have today. The result is what we have today in our Old Testament. And then this particular group of literature, and we'll talk about kind of more of that development next week, but this literature over time gained significant religious status for this particular group of people. So this might be one way to describe the Old Testament. So what's in the Old Testament? It's a variety of literary genres or types of literature. So there are all different kinds of literary types in the Old Testament. We have narratives of various kinds, very nationalistic narratives. We have very personal family narratives. We have funny stories. We have stories that are political propaganda. We have bad stories, good stories, all different kinds of stories. But not only stories, we also have laws regulating the nation of Israel, you might say, almost constitutional type laws, down to the regulation of personal practice, so very personal type laws. We have poetry of all kinds, including love poetry. We have popular sayings that originated in popular culture and eventually were collected and written down. An example of this is in the book of Proverbs. We have other oral literature that was eventually written down. So when scholars look at elements of narratives, for example, they can detect patterns of orality. So we know that, as I mentioned earlier, that people repeated these stories orally, many of these stories orally, before they were eventually written down. And the entire Old Testament was composed over a period of about 1,000 years. So what makes the Old Testament remarkable? Well, the fact that we even have it is very remarkable. Again, this was from a very small culture, a very minor culture on the world stage in its time. And the fact that we even have this material is somewhat of a miracle. In addition, much of what is in the Old Testament, as we'll be seeing in this class, is self-critical. In other words, the Israelites are not fully about telling you how great their own particular culture and their own particular government is. Now, when we compare this literature to other literatures in the ancient Near East, most empires will have volumes and volumes of literature telling you about their great kings, about how they won all their battles and they subjugated all the people around them. There's a lot of stretching of the truth to glorify the country. And much of what we see in the Old Testament is actually critical of Israel, saying the things that they did wrong, the ways that they failed. So that makes it quite unique in the world of ancient literature. And I think another thing that is remarkable about the Old Testament is that much of the material is still readable and meaningful today. And what I mean by this is if you read through, let's say, the mythology of ancient Egypt or ancient Akkadian mythology, so the culture that lived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what would be modern day Iraq, a lot of that material is a little bit obscure and hard to relate to. And when we get to the biblical material, we can make out a huge chunk of what is going on in the narratives. The stories are clear, and what's more, they still convey meaning for today. Is there a common theme in the Old Testament? This actually was a very popular question in the late 19th, particularly in the early 20th century, and especially among German scholars. They would talk about the Mitte, the middle or midpoint of the Old Testament in terms of sort of how can we understand the Old Testament as having one common theme. And some scholars have said, well, the common theme is that the Old Testament is what they're calling the monotheistic manifesto, which points to another unique feature of the Old Testament in that the Israelites were monotheists, or were eventually monotheists by the time the Old Testament ends. So that was very unusual in the ancient world. Other cultures were polytheistic, worshiping many gods, even if they did have one main national god. But Israelites had one main national god, and by the end of the Old Testament, that is the God. That is the God of the world. And ultimately, we probably would say that there is no one singular theme in the Old Testament, no one center. However, for this particular course, we're going to look at three overarching themes. So I tried to pick what I thought were the three most important themes in the Old Testament. And they are, first of all, the justice and mercy of God. So I'll show you how we can look at some of the stories of the Old Testament and see how they raise questions about justice and about God's mercy and our justice and our own mercy. Second theme that we're going to talk about is what I'm calling kingship or kinship. In other words, how are the people of God meant to live? So in the Bible, there's a tension between kingship and empire and kinship or family relationship. And they seem to be, in some sense, opposed or in conflict. And the Israelites are always struggling, wanting kingship, but the text showing them that kinship, that family relationships are actually more vital. And we'll get into this more later in the course. And then another common theme that I'd like to pick on is life fair? Is God truly just? So theologians call this the question of theodicy. And basically, it's the mystery of why bad things happen to good people, and conversely, why good things happen to bad people. And how does this fit into the justice and mercy of God? So there's a whole body of literature in the Bible that is concerned with this one particular important question. These are the three themes that we're going to be covering in this